Okay, everybody, welcome to the New Growers Workshop series. I'm Jeff Wasielewski. We're also joined by Dr. Jonathan Crane. We're going to be talking about flooding, droughts, and hurricanes, what you can do before and what you can do afterwards. Everybody is going to be on mute, and you also have your video off, so there's no shenanigans after the three talks. I'm going to talk about flooding. Jonathan's going to talk about drought. And we're going to share hurricanes. And then after that, we're going to do a quick survey, just a 3-minute survey, and then we'll do questions and answers in the chat. So that sounds good to me. Let's get going. So first thing you want to do, especially if you're a new grower and you're buying land, and I do get new growers coming in that just bought land and they probably haven't done this. You need to locate your flood zone and your soil type. So you can go to this website and you can search for your county flood zone. Example, Martin County, Miami-Dade. You can also contact the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service and get a web soil survey. You can move the map to the Homestead or Florida City area, wherever you're at. Click on your location to get your flood zone. So that map down below, interactive, you can move that around and you see the different colors. So the purple would be a lower area, so you need to be careful if you're in that area. Those purple areas in the middle there, that middle part here is higher limestone, and the purple is where the water used to come down from the north from Lake Okeechobee. So what is flooding stress? Excessive soil moisture or flooding of part of the soil profile resulting in an overabundance of water. So you get a lot of water. You get low oxygen or no oxygen. That's really the problem. And you're going to see some of the things that I talk about are very similar to drought because you're not able to get water with the roots. And the lack of oxygen may lead to detrimental effects on plant physiology, biochemistry, growth and development, and crop yield. And insect pests. It's generally not a beneficial environmental stimulus for tropical fruit crops. Production has been used to stimulate flowers in some crops. Just got news that my internet is unstable, so hopefully we'll hold on here. Factors involved in flooding stress: climate and weather, season, temperatures, atmospheric demand for water, cloudiness and rainfall frequency and amount, plant species, and we'll look at these again on the next slide. Biochemical and morphological adaptations, soil type, soil texture, soil depth, soil moisture holding capacity. Think about the oolitic limestone that we have here in South Florida. That's going to drain rather well. So you're not going to get in trouble till you hit the water that's below. And then the duration of flooding or excessive soil moisture. So let's break it down. Climate and weather. Season, more damage in spring and summer. Temperatures, higher temperatures, more stressful. The higher the VPD, the more stressful. Cloudiness and rainfall frequency. Okay, so that's climate and weather. Now plant species. We're going to look at a list later that shows you fruit trees that are more tolerant, less tolerant, and kind of in the middle. So the effects depend on the genetics and environmental conditions. Soil type, the texture. If you have poorly to well-drained soil, well, you can have poorly drained soil or well-drained, and that's really going to be a big difference. Remember those purple spots on that map, that's going to be poorly drained soil, where the white is going to be well-drained. That's higher up, and that's more limestone. more rock. Water will go right through that. Soil depth. Is there a hard pan present? Do you have like a clay area that the water's not going to be able to get through and it's going to pool? Soil moisture holding capacity, and the duration of flooding or excessive soil moisture. So how long does it last? Does it come in and then drain away, or does it come there and sit 2 to 3 days? Variables involved in surviving a flood. Okay, we want to get through the flood. So like I said just now, flooding duration. How long is the soil saturated or flooded? The longer, the more detrimental. Flooding depth. How deep is the water? The deeper, the worse it is. Temperatures. Higher temperatures, the more detrimental the flooding. BPD, the greater evapotranspiration demand, the more detrimental the flooding stress. Tree health. This is something when you have unhealthy trees, they can get hit by a lot of things, including flood stress, and unhealthy trees will die faster, take longer to recover than healthy trees. What about the stage of growth? Trees with fruit are more damaged than trees without fruit. So if the trees are carrying a load of fruit, they're putting a lot of energy into that, they're not going to be able to survive the flooding or do well with it. Dormant trees are more tolerant than actively growing trees. What are the symptoms? And I think once we get to drought, you're going to see a lot of these are very similar. So you have leaf wilting, reduced leaf size, chlorosis, nutrient deficiencies, so they can't get nutrients. Because remember, the roots are unable to get oxygen, so they're unable to work. Leaves are going to fall, stem dieback, reduced flowering and fruit set, and reduced fruit size. So these are not good things. Fruit are falling, reduced crop yields, reduced fruit quality, greater alternate bearing. So some trees, it's believed they'll fruit really well 1 year, and then the next year they'll take off, and then the next year they'll fruit again. So this is going to happen more when they went through some flooding stress. It's going to be more pronounced. Increased susceptibility to damage from other stresses. So you have the flood stress, something else gets in there, it can hit it a little harder than it would. And then finally, tree death. So here's some pictures of flooding in Florida. Further north, you have the sandy flatwoods area. So this is a lot of sand. So you see the water's pooling up there. Then we have our limestone rock in Homestead and Avocados, very flooded there. And remember, a lot of these flooding events take place when hurricanes come in or tropical storms and just kind of sit and drop all that rain, or they push the storm surge up. So you can have both hurricane and flooding. Here's a papaya. The whole plant is wilting. Papayas are very susceptible to flooding. Meme sapote, you have leaf wilting. So you might look at that and say, oh, this is drought. It's not getting enough water. And it's not getting enough water. That's because there's so much water that the roots can no longer work. So here's an Arcan carambola showing leaf chlorosis. So it can't get the nutrients it needs. So that's probably an iron deficiency. And there's a meme that has died due to flooding. And there's a lot of diseases that when the ground is flooded, that they can get into the tree. Like for instance, with meme, you can get Pythium root rot. And that's kind of in the ground already. But once the flood gets there, it activates it. So here's a bedded grove. So the trees are a little bit higher. A lot of water there. These are mangoes, very nicely pruned, by the way. But hopefully that that water will drain down, but these are higher than they would be if they weren't bedded, so they have a better chance of getting through the flood. So the effects of flooding stress: oxygen-starved roots do not take up water and nutrients. This is what I've been mentioning, that the roots can't get oxygen because they're underwater and they can no longer take up water. Even though there's water all around them, they can't get water or nutrients. So it's a drought and nutrient stress. The trees no longer do photosynthesis. They close their stomata. These are little things that open and close to let out water, and they stop growing. The leaves will turn chlorotic and begin to drop off, resulting in a reduced number of leaves, reduced tree canopy size. So you see, it's like all these effects from the flooding. Just keeps rolling and rolling. Physiological effects of flooding stress: the lack of sufficient oxygen in the root zone. You're going to have a drastic change in the energy production needed for normal cell functions, as the roots are no longer working. Net amount of energy produced in the respiration fermentation pathway is 94% less. So that's a lot. The plant is starving for energy to maintain itself, let alone grow. So it can't get any energy, it can't get any food, so it can't even survive, let alone grow new leaves. Fermentation leads to a decrease in cells, cytoplasm pH, so you have plant death. Active root uptakes of nutrients and phloem transport of plant nutrients to the xylem slows or ceases, leading to nutrient deficiency in aerial tissues. In other words, things can't go up and down anymore. So xylem, water goes up in the xylem, phloem, food goes down. So that all kind of gets shut down, and you can no longer, the tree can no longer survive. You can get premature leaf drop once you lose those leaves. You can't do photosynthesis, and remember, the phloem sends down the food from the photosynthesis, and that's not working anyway. You also have reduced root water uptake due to the loss of cell membrane permeability, cell tissue death, and stomatal closure. So the whole plant is just shutting down. So we need to get that water. Hopefully it's there for just a little while and then it drains off. If it's there for a couple of days, all these things can start happening. So what we're looking at here, this would not be the oolitic limestone down in South Florida. This would be where you have a hard pan. If you look at that, I'll show you with my mouse. If you look at right here, so this is an area where water is not going to be able to get through. So it goes through surface soil A, surface soil B. It hits that hard pan and it pools up, water ponding. So all these roots that are in here, they're just underwater and they can't get oxygen, remember, so the tree begins to shut down. So here we are in the rockland, so it's a little more complicated. So we have the flooding up here. We have the soil surface in this blue line. Flooding goes down. The plow layer is where they went on the limestone and just kind of broke it up. So there's just some broken rock there for about 4 to 8 inches. And sometimes you have a trench, 16 to 24 inches. This is a trench here. So you could get the water through there. And then the water goes down, down, down. But down here, you have the actual water level. So that can begin to get pulled up. So you're going to get these roots here underwater. This is the aquifer down here. So what can the plant do? It can develop parenchyma tissue. It can develop hypertrophied lenticels. And those two, if you look, the asterisk Then at the bottom right, most tropical fruit crops do not do this. Lignification or subrization of root cells to prevent oxygen leakage out of the root, so it can kind of close itself up, get a little woody. Oxygenization of the rhizosphere root zone. Then you have premature leaf senescence, fruit drop, stem dieback. So it's trying to drop things so it can hold on. Production of anaerobic stress proteins that increases cell cytosolic pH and enhance the fermentation respiration pathways in an effort to maintain energy levels. It's a mouthful. So what about flood tolerance? We're going to look at a couple lists of flood tolerant, not so tolerant, and in the middle. So tolerant, flood tolerant fruit crops will survive excessively wet, high water table, and flooded conditions for several days to even a few weeks. However, the stress of wet soil conditions may reduce tree growth and fruit production. In addition, root disease may develop, resulting in tree damage or death. So just because it's tolerant, it's not going to be great. If it's there for a few weeks, you're still going to have these problems. So that's tolerant. Moderately tolerant, in the middle. They'll survive several days instead of weeks of excessively wet or flooded soil, but the stress of wet conditions may reduce tree growth and fruit production. In addition, root disease may develop. So tolerant, you can go longer, moderately, little less. And both of them, you can still get some bad results. Okay, not tolerant or intolerant. Trees not tolerant of wet or flooded soil conditions may sustain heavy damage or be killed by a day or few days. So I mentioned this earlier, soil-borne diseases will greatly influence plant reaction to and recovery from flooding. Wet soils are ideal for root-rotting fungi to destroy the root system. So once you get those wet soils, these fungi kind of wake up and they start attacking the roots. They can move around rather well. So tolerant, moderately tolerant. You have tolerant, guava, maybe sapodilla, we're not sure. Kaimito, coconut, that makes sense. Grafted citrus, it depends on the rootstock. And mango, and then wax jambu. So these are more tolerant. Moderately tolerant in the middle. Carambola, Tahiti lime, again, depends on the rootstock. Canistel, mango, also moderately tolerant. Banana, not sure about lychee and longan, but we think they're in the moderately tolerant range. And then meme, sapote. Okay, flood tolerance. So not tolerant. Avocado, that's one that's known for being not liking its feet being wet. Papaya, we saw that picture earlier where that papaya was just dying. Sugar apple, Adamoya, passion fruit, jackfruit, and not sure about dragon fruit, but we would assume it's not tolerant since it is a cactus. So those are all the things that can happen. What about steps to avoid flood stress, to mitigate? So we're talking about what happens from these disasters and then what you can do before and after. So one thing you can do is to grow flood tolerant fruit crop. We just looked at a list. Select a growth site that does not have the potential to flood. This is super, super important, especially if you haven't bought your land yet, you're thinking about it. This is something you really need to research before you do anything else. Select a growth site with soil that drains well, has no hardpan layers that impede water movement. So Remember that picture from the first slide, that blue area, that area is marl. So that's like a hard clay. So that's more like a hard pan. So that's going to hold water. You can install infrastructure such as drainage canals and ditches, land sloping, pumping stations. This is very hard, especially in South Florida. Here's something you can do. You can build beds prior or during grove establishment. This might be something to think about, especially as we get more and more weather events. You can break up the hard pan. So if you do have hard pan, these solid clay type areas under the ground, you can take a backhoe and just kind of break it up a little where you're going to plant your trees. Some fruit tree crops have fungicides registered to reduce root rot. And in general, it should be applied prior to flooding. So there are some things you can do, but you need to usually put them before you get the flood. So recovery, try to drain off or allow water to drain off. That's difficult. Remove a portion of the tree canopy after the flooding event has occurred. Remember, the tree can no longer get water. So just like you would do after a hurricane, when you reset a tree, or just like you would do during a drought, you're going to take off some of those leaves so it doesn't lose so much water out of the leaves. And this will reduce the transpiration load on the root system after the flooding event. You can also remove the fruit. Remember, we said the fruit is going to pull a lot of energy of the tree, so let's take that off. If leaves are present, if a soil applied fungicide is registered for the crop, apply according to label instructions. And then wait several weeks to evaluate the extent of damage or tree death. You're not going to see it right away, so wait, see what happens. So as the trees recover, as you start to see those little tiny new leaves, you can apply low rates of fertilizer frequently. So don't hit them all at once. Little bites of fertilizer as you go forward. Pay close attention to irrigation. Don't overwater, but give the tree enough to encourage root and tree growth. So you're going to really treat these trees as new plantings. So these are some resources. USDA Farm Service Agency offers financial assistance for environmental disasters. So if you have a flood or a drought or a hurricane, you need to register your farm with them prior to a disaster. Here's some links below. You can Google FSA, USDA resources programs. That will probably get you there. Remember, you have to register your farm. So you just go to them, it's free. You say, I have 5 acres of dragon fruit, or I have 5 acres of avocado, whatever it is. And then that will be protected if it's covered by them. That will be protected for some of their programs. So I'm going to pass the baton here.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
So let me sorry.
And guys, as Jonathan is talking, I'm going to put some PDFs, some publications into the chat that you can grab if you like.
Sorry. I had this up and going. Here we go. Okay. Sorry. I'll share the screen. Hopefully you can see this now, right?
Yes.
Can you still see it?
Now I see Zoom Workplace.
Okay, now you see it. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
And hopefully you're still seeing this.
There you go.
Okay, good. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about drought stress and crop production. Thank you, Jeff, for the previous talk on flooding. So, I think everybody knows what drought stress is. It's obviously a lack of sufficient water for the trees and for its functioning, right? And that includes growth, crop yields, fruit quality, uh, its physiology. There are some uses of drought stress. It can contribute to and enhance cool or cold weather induced dormancy. So there are some plants like lychee and longan that when they're dormant, and especially if they need to be dormant during the cool part of the year. And so that cool part of the year induces dormancy. And if you have some drought stress, and I don't mean severe drought stress, but mild to moderate drought stress, it enhances that dormancy. And so it can be a contributing environmental factor for when things warm up and the trees get access to water or irrigation in the spring, that it will enhance the flowering response. But you have to be careful. There have been cases people drought stress their trees too much, and then the trees didn't do well after that. So some of the factors, let me just, I'm gonna hide this. No, sorry. Um, I was just trying to hide the controls. Okay. So factors involved, as you would suspect, include what time of year the drought stress is happening during the winter and the summer. And, it's generally more detrimental during the summer when the temperatures are higher. And it also depends on how high the temperatures do get. If we have severe high temperatures, and especially if the relative humidity is low, another way of saying that is if there's a high vapor pressure deficit. In other words, the demand by the atmosphere, because it has a lower relative humidity, is so high for water, it makes the plants lose water more rapidly and the drought more severe. And of course, cloudiness and rainfall frequency and amount help by reducing drought stress because it reduces the incident sunlight and is also providing water for the plants. And it also depends on the plant species. So some are more tolerant than others. Some have some adaptations that they can employ to tolerate the drought stress. And of course, factors involved in drought stress include the soil texture and the soil depth. So sandy soils generally hold much less water than clay soils or sandy loam soils, right? And how deep is the soil? So does the tree have access to, 2 feet, 5 feet of soil depth? If it has more soil depth that it can hold soil moisture, it can access some of that lower depth water. And it also depends on the soil moisture holding capacity of the different soils. And sands generally have much less soil water holding capacity than, let's say, a sandy loam or a clay soil. And then, of course, it depends on how long is the drought. Is it short term or long term? And as I think many of you know, we've been having drought conditions this spring off and on, but quite a bit on this year. It's been quite dry, especially during some periods, and that has a potential to cause some problems for flowering, fruiting, and also fruit sizing and fruit quality. Let's see if I can get okay. So a little bit about vapor pressure, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but it is the difference between let me put it, the vapor pressure is the driving force for the loss of water through plants by transpiration, right? And so When you have an increase in temperature, but there's no increase in relative humidity, or you have low relative humidities, that vapor pressure, as I mentioned before, goes up. And so the demand for water goes up. And so the drier the air and the warmer the temperatures, the greater the demand the atmosphere has for water. And this results in a greater potential for water loss from the tree. And that includes water loss through the stomata and the leaves, but also through the cuticle of the leaves. So here's showing you stomata. This is a depiction of a leaf. On the back side of the leaf are these stomata, or these little these cells that have two sides to them that can open and close. And the purpose of those is to allow CO2 in for photosynthesis and carbon assimilation. But when it opens those cells on the bottom of the leaf, it's also allowing water out, which cools the leaf, and it also draws water into the plant. So from the soil to the roots, through the tree, and then out through the stomata. And that's the driving force, and that's the pathway that water moves through the trees. And so when you have a high vapor pressure deficit or low relative humidity and high temperatures, these stomata tend to close, but you can also have water loss through the waxy cuticle of the leaf. And in some cases, you can also lose water through small openings in the stems called lenticels. Oops, how do I go back? Sorry. This one thing. Nope. Thanks to this. Sorry. Okay. So symptoms very similar to flooding, and that's because it's the same thing, that if the plant is not taking up water, then you end up with the leaves wilting. And in this case, it's because of a lack of water, not because you have too much water and low oxygen in the root system. So again, it can result in smaller leaves. The leaves don't get as big. It can result in yellow leaves or nutrient deficiencies because the plant's not taking up water and nutrients. You can end up dropping leaves. You can end up with stem dieback. And of course, this can also reduce flowering and fruit set. So critical time to be paying attention to the weather and your trees is during flowering and fruit set and fruit development. Because if they're drought stressed, they may have reduced flowering, reduced fruit set, and reduced fruit size. You can also end up with fruit abscission. Of course, that results in reduced crop yields and increased susceptibility from damage from other stresses. So if you have drought stress, and then in the winter you get exposed to freezing stress, that's an added problem. Okay, so I think everybody's seen this is avocados with drought stress. You can see this is a banana leaf showing drought stress. This is bananas on the bottom here on the right. And this is actually drought stress, and it's showing that with a lack of water, it's not taking up water and nutrients, especially nutrients. So the plants become chlorotic or yellow, showing nutrient deficiency. It also dwarfs them because they don't have access to water so that they can grow. This is symptoms of drought stress as well. Well, on the top left is carambola leaves that are well watered and they're somewhat in mottled shade or mottled sunlight. On the bottom, this plant is experiencing high light, high heat, and perhaps drought stress, and you can see the leaves fold. So carambolas actually have little motor cells on the leaflets that go up and back, and if they're drought stressed, or the sunlight is too high, it folds those leaves to reduce the exposure to the atmosphere. Longan, this is showing drought and nutrient stress and overproduction. So in this case, that tree in the background there is loaded with fruit. It was never thinned. Plus, the tree was undergoing some drought stress. It wasn't being irrigated, and also nutrient stress, and subsequently you ended up with a dead tree. So some of the physiological effects of drought stress include a loss of turgor inside the cells. And why is that important? Because if you lose turgor inside those cells, you end up with reduced size to whether it's leaves or whether it's fruit. And so it becomes very important, especially if you're looking to have the fruit get larger. It can also increase leaf drop, so you end up with fewer leaves, a smaller canopy, a less efficient canopy. Um, Also, because of this change in the roots and the shoots, and the amount of roots, the amount of shoots, you can increase this competition among the fruit that's on the tree, the roots, and the new shoots for growth and for water. Also, as I mentioned before, the leaves on the stomata do sense the declining soil moisture. And when that happens, they also produce a naturally produced plant growth regulator called abscisic acid. This also enhances the leaves to close their stomata. However, usually, even if you water the plant well, it usually takes 3 or 4 days for that abscisic acid to dissipate and the stomata to become fully functional again. So you also end up with less biomass accumulation per unit use of water. So you're producing less carbohydrates, less energy for the plant um, when it's needed. So some of the other effects. So what happens too is that when the trees get drought stressed, is that the roots can actually resist taking up water, partly because the roots actually shrink, perhaps somewhat, and so they lose the intimate contact with the soil, right? So there's a little gap there, and that makes it harder for it to absorb water. If it has root hairs on the roots, which are super important for most trees, those can end up dying. So again, reducing the water uptake potential. Also, the roots can sometimes suberize. So they form like a waxy layer on the outside to protect themselves, but it reduces their ability to take up water. So you can also end up with breaking the water columns inside the vessel elements in the xylem. And again, that reduces water uptake. And so I've already mentioned, so this drought stress, it reduces the flowering, the fruit set, the crop yields, and the fruit quality. So this is just trying to show you the sensitivity of various physiological processes inside the plant and inside the cells, and the darker part. So plants are when they're drought stressed, photosynthesis shuts down quickly, the stomata close quickly, protein synthesis is also affected, the cell wall synthesis is very affected, as is cell expansion. So they're very sensitive to even the beginnings of mild stress, and then this is severe stress. So some of the adaptations to drought stress include deep or extensive root system. And so if it has access to a deep soil profile, that's an advantage. You can have some root growth in that area. And they can access that water on occasion. Also, what happens is the cells will sometimes, the solutes, the materials inside the cell, will concentrate. And this helps make possible for the tree to continue to absorb water and continue to remain turgid. And so there is somewhat, they call it osmotic adjustment. Also, some plants have lactiferous cells, like mangoes. So when you pull a mango off the tree or break a leaf, and you'll see this sort of white sap, that is a latex. Bananas have this as well, and that is thought to also help the plant tolerate some dry conditions. I already mentioned about the carambolas reorienting their leaves. And again, stomatal closure is a very common response to drought stress. Also, some trees have the ability for increasing the waxy layer on the leaves. And then again, one final strategy is leaf or fruit senescence. So some trees will tolerate drought conditions by dropping their leaves or dropping the fruit. And it's just a survival mode. And also leaves that have hairs on them tend to be more drought tolerant than leaves that don't. And that's because the trichomes tend to impede the water loss from the leaves. So an example of avocado water relations and drought stress, and it turns out avocado leaves are not only sensitive to drought, but also low relative humidity. So if it's dry out there, they'll start to close their stomata. Maybe not all the way, but once they've been closed, it usually takes 4 or more days after rewatering for those stomata to reopen and the tree to regain its ability to fix high amounts of carbon or photosynthesis, right? And also drought stress increases and aggravates spring and summer fruit drop. So most of you know that, trees set fruit, and then they generally drop a lot of fruit during that fruit setting period. And then usually there's at least one, maybe more other periods later on where they drop fruit. Well, if the trees are drought stressed, that's going to increase the amount of fruit that it drops. Also, with avocados, they can get a thing called ring neck, which is a fruit disorder. So the fruit becomes distorted and becomes more difficult to market because it has this distortion, right? And most of you probably know that, the majority of the roots and the water absorption, even in the sandy soils, is generally in the top 24 inches. Probably 90% of the water and nutrients taken up is in that top layer. So these are the general symptoms. I've talked about this, and Jeff talked about this with flooding as well. You can end up where you have trees that, have a big crop one year and no crop the next year. It throws them into this cycle of big crop, low crop, right? You saw this before, drought stress in the avocados. Here it is in the bananas. And again, this is because of drought stress. And I happened to be in this grove looking at this, and their irrigation system was broken. And this was what was going on. And so those bananas were stunted, reduced leaf size, and you see their nitrogen deficiency and probably some iron deficiency as well. So some of the symptoms you saw there with bananas, leaf folding, it takes them longer to unfurl new leaves. They end up with less chlorophyll in the leaves. The leaves die sooner. There's a reduced rate in the pseudostem growth. Um, Increased choking. What do I mean by that? So what happens is normally in a healthy banana stalk that's going to flower, it sends the inflorescence through the center of the plant, and then expresses flowering and fruiting. If the plants are drought stressed, it may push that fruiting stalk through the pseudostem. So, or it may not emerge from the end of the pseudostem. And so it also takes much longer for the tree to come into flowering and fruiting. And you end up with smaller fruit, smaller bunches. So some of the avoidance or recovery from drought stress. So, planting in areas where there's sufficient rainfall at critical times. That's not, of course, always possible. So we're in an area here, in Florida, gets quite a bit of rainfall. However, it's not evenly distributed throughout the year. So there are, like we are right now, we're facing some drought conditions. We've been facing some drought conditions during the flowering and fruiting and fruit development period. So you end up with a reduced canopy and a reduced canopy. Also, you want to facilitate deep rooting by the trees. Now, if you're in deep South Dade, where you have the oolitic limestone bedrock, Jeff alluded to this earlier with the trenching. So the farthest the roots can go down is about 18 to 24 inches into those trenches. If you're in sandy soils or sandy loams, in some cases those roots can actually, some of the tap roots and things like that can go down, 5 feet, maybe more. So that's a deep rooting. Also, in some cases, one way is if you are if you're afraid you're going to lose the tree, your irrigation system breaks, the trees are loaded with fruit. You can remove the fruit in an effort to save the tree because, you know, the fruit, you can look at the fruit as a sink or let's say a burden on the tree. So a lot of water and nutrients are attracted to the fruit. And so by removing the fruit, you're removing that burden of having to get water, right? So the rest of the tree can recover. So you could save the tree, but you'd end up losing part or all of the crop by removing it. There are some anti-transparents that people have used in the past. Basically, you're putting a barrier on the leaves. You're spraying this material on the leaves. The danger in that is that if you clog up the stomata, remember I was talking about the stomata allow water to move through the tree and through the plant, and it cools the leaves off. If you stop up those stomata, if you plug those stomata, now the leaf has lost its mechanism for cooling itself off. And you could actually end up causing a lot of damage by clogging up the stomata. So they're generally not practical. And so, you know, the best solution is to irrigate to avoid this type of stress. So again, there's tolerant, moderately tolerant, and not tolerant trees. And again, even with the tolerant trees, you know, drought stress can reduce growth and yields. Same thing even with the moderately tolerant. And of course, those that aren't tolerant, you definitely get a much quicker negative response from drought stress. So this is a list of some of the tolerant species. And just because they're tolerant, like I said, does not mean that drought stress is a good thing for them or that they're going to do well, but they'll survive. That's the idea. There's a longer list of moderately tolerant ones. Tropical fruits there. And then generally not tolerant, layered citrus. Why? Because their root system is much more superficial than a grafted tree. Papayas really and bananas, these plants want to keep on growing and drought stress stops them from growing. It's going to reduce their production and fruit quality. You could also add to that list passion fruit for sure. So some of the variables involved, just like in flooding stress, but this is drought stress, is how long is the drought? How hot is it? How dry is it? What is the tree's health? And then what stage of growth does the drought occur? Does it occur during the winter when the trees generally are not growing and would be more tolerant? Or is it happening when the tree is loaded with fruit, which is a big problem for the tree and also for the fruit production? So mitigating drought stress, one of the things I would emphasize with potential growers or new growers is that you need to contact the water management district in your area. And there are 5 districts in Florida. And you have to actually apply for a water use permit in order to draw water either from the ground or from, let's say, ponds, things like that, and determine how much water you can access per year. And this will, of course, influence the type of irrigation system you install and have access to. And we have a fact sheet on irrigation systems for tropical fruits. They're on EDIS or Ask IFAS. You can download that, and it talks about the uses and the pros and cons of these different irrigation systems. And you'd want to know that because depending on how much access to water you have will influence what type of system you may want to install. So water requirements as an example for avocado in this case. So some of the factors include rainfall, the demand for water, the plant size, its age, its growth stage, the time of the year, the current weather, and also tree spacing. So if you're in an area that if you don't have access to a lot of water or sufficient water, by increasing the spacing between plants, you increase the soil profile that's available for the tree to access water. Whereas if you put them all close together, you may find that they're going to be competing for water among themselves much more quickly. This is just to show you a growth chart of avocado, and I know it's very complicated, but some of the very sensitive stages include, flowering and the flowering and fruit set period. Jeff, are you able to see my pointer or no? No?
Yes.
Okay. So this period here during flowering and fruit set is very sensitive to drought stress. So if you're drought stressed during this period, you may end up with much less fruit, right? And then, of course, fruit development. Fruit development really, fruit sizing, you could say, really depends on the turgor pressure inside the cells. And if it's drought stressed, those cells don't have the sufficient pressure to expand those cells, hence make the fruit bigger. So that's another very sensitive stage, this whole fruit development period. So flowering and fruit set, fruit development period, super important. And then, of course, if you've got drought stress during these two periods, which there are two fruit drop periods for avocados, then you increase the amount of fruit that's dropped. This is another way to look at it. This is a Simmons avocado and some of the cultural practices. So I apologize. The average temperatures here are for this area are in Celsius. So you're looking at, the 60s, 70s in here. And this is showing you the amount of rainfall, and it's in millimeters, but you can look at it relatively. Here's our rainy season, May through October. And then this is the demand for water loss in millimeters per month. And you can see it increases dramatically during our summer period, right? And then this is something called a crop coefficient. In other words, this was determined through work looking at how much water loss of the tree compared to water loss from a standard weather station pan. And so, and you could look at this as like 98% of that 63.5 millimeters per month. So this would be through the tree. The tree's losing 98% of this. So almost, let's say 60%, 60 millimeters as compared to 63.5. And this will be used later in managing irrigation if you want. And so some very important periods again, flowering, fruit set, the fruit drop period, important to avoid fruit drop as much as possible. Fruit development period again. And then irrigation. So this, you can see irrigation becomes very important during these flowering, fruit set, fruit development period. And so you want to be irrigating when necessary from flowering through harvest. So many different types of irrigation, and you'll find that in this fact sheet. So we don't have to, go over everything in detail, but there are many types of irrigation in Florida, and it varies depending on on how much water you have access to from the water management districts and the type of system that's needed for your soil type and plant type. So flood irrigation, this is not very common anymore. It's where either the entire grove or the land between the rows, between the beds of trees is filled with water, and then it moves into the soil profile, and then it's drained off. It requires well-drained soil and generally flood-tolerant species. You want to have all the infrastructure, land contouring, ditches, canals. You need water pumps to move the water on and off the land and rapidly drain, right? And so in general, this is used in areas where the trees are planted on beds, such as in the flatwoods areas where citrus was commonly put on beds. It is labor intensive and it tends to be a rather inefficient. In other words, the irrigation water is not necessarily really evenly distributed throughout the whole profile or the land area, but it is a workable system. Some of the advantage initial costs can be low, depends, if you have to do a lot of contouring and bedding and putting in tiles, then that may be expensive. It does work well for some crops. You can use water that's not been filtered, so that might be an advantage. Some of the disadvantages is you need high pump pressures are required for good water distribution. And again, you need to have the proper land and ditch contours. Disadvantages, possible cost, as I mentioned, with putting those infrastructure in the beds and the canals and the ditches. Also, some possible runoff and soil erosion, and it tends to be inefficient in regards to how evenly distributed the water is. High volume overtree irrigation, here you see this metal pipe, and this is generally at 10 to 15 feet, depending on the crop, and it's, as it says, over the tree irrigation. Usually galvanized pipe. If it is PVC, it needs to be staked to stabilize it. Generally, they're spaced pretty wide apart, and they have an overlapping pattern, so the whole grove is irrigated. And this talks about, the sprinkler heads make a rotation in about a minute, the amount of pump pressure, so you need large enough pumps to move this water through the system. And generally, they apply somewhere between 0.2, 0.25 inches of water per acre per hour. And they're moderately efficient, although the wind can distort that pattern quite a bit. Advantage, complete land cover, works well for many crops, can be used in freeze protection. That's probably one of the biggest advantages, is it can be used in freeze protection. Not everywhere in Florida has access to sufficient water in order to use this system. It depends on the water management district and the amount of water you're allowed to use or pull from that area, whether you could use this high volume system or not. Can be costly to put in, and you need a good pump and high pressures. So you need to maintain some of the disadvantages. You need to maintain that sprinkler head, and if it's 10 feet above the ground, these poles are generally put in where you can disassemble them to work on the sprinkler head. There is the wind distortion, requires clean water, otherwise it's going to clog. And you're getting the tree surfaces and the fruit wet, which if you have problems with diseases can cause more problems. This is a high volume under tree, very similar to the high volume over tree, but obviously under tree. This is anywhere from 2 to 3 feet high. Here you see on the right a picture of a lychee tree with the sprinkler being pointed out underneath the tree canopy. Again, probably the biggest difference with this is that you generally need to put in this high volume under tree system, and you need to have it at least in every other row because of the trees interfering with each other. Okay. It does shoot water up to about 8 feet, which can be advantageous in cold protection. You need pump pressures of 40 psi or more. And they're moderately efficient. They have much less wind distortion because they're closer to the ground and because the trees are breaking up or protecting it from a lot of wind, right? So it is easier to repair than overhead sprinklers. Less wind distortion, as I mentioned. It can be used and has been used in freeze protection. Again, though, it's high initial cost. You're putting in these sprinklers every other row, whereas the high volume over tree, it was about every third row or fourth row, depending on the size of the system. You can end up with some of the trees interfering with irrigating some of the other trees in the other row. And there's more cost in materials because you have more lines of irrigation. This is an in-tree system. You don't see this very commonly. And you can see it has a spinner type head, and it's actually located on the inside of this tree here. And it has, again, this one has actually one riser for each tree, so it's much more intensive. Applies much more water per minute per tree. They use these sprinkler heads that are spinners, basically. Moderately efficient, but you're using high volumes of water. You have to have access to a lot of water. This has, very little wind distortion because it's inside the canopy. Excellent for freeze protection, but not very common because of how much water and the pumping capacity you need in order to have a type high volume sprinkler for each and every tree, right? So big initial investment, and like I said, high volumes of water use. So not many places in Florida have access to that amount of water. High volume gun. This is used mostly in vegetable production. It has been used in some fruit crops, but it's not common anymore. And again, the advantage of using these high volume guns is that they're mobile. And so you can move from one site to another. They are prone to wind distortion, so they're not very efficient. Then we get into low and high volume micro sprinkler irrigation. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then, of course, low volume drip system. And it depends on what you're growing and the type of soil you have on which one of these systems might be more advantageous. So the micro sprinklers, low volume would be somewhere between 10 and 20 gallons per sprinkler per hour, but you can find and also have installed systems that put in 40 gallons per sprinkler per hour or more. The advantage of using the higher volumes is that not only can it be used for irrigation, but it can be used potentially for some cold protection. As you know, they're polyethylene tubing with hard plastic spray heads. They require smaller pumps than the high volume systems I mentioned earlier. It is true that the larger the ground area covered by the water, the better the plant response because more of the roots are receiving water, and they tend to be much more efficient than those previous systems I talked about. As I mentioned, advantages, less pumping size. One thing I should mention is that let's say you had 10 acres and you wanted to use it for irrigation, but also cold protection. In order for you to use it for cold protection, you're going to need a large enough pump that the entire 10 acres can be run all at the same time. It's not going to work in any capacity for cold protection if you have to turn zone A on and then turn that off so you can irrigate zone B during a freeze. You can't turn the water off and on during freezes to protect the trees. So you would need a larger pump that can do all 10 acres at the same time. Can be easier to maintain than the high volume systems. It does need to be checked. It needs good quality water, good filters, otherwise it gets clogged. Disadvantages, quite a bit of cost, quite a bit of money to put in. There is some wind distortion, especially for young trees, much less so for large trees. It can be labor intensive. There is a high maintenance requirement. You have to make sure those sprinklers are working. And potentially could be used for some freeze protection. Drip systems, these apply low volumes of water. The polyethylene tubing, runs along the soil surface. Low pump pressures, high efficiency. Some of the advantages, obviously, smaller pumps, lower volumes of water needed per acre, can be easier to maintain. Again, you need well-filtered water. One of the issues is the distribution in sandy or rocky soils. It may not be sufficient for delivering enough water for large trees. And so you may end up with 2 or 3 lines of drip in order to get sufficient water out there, covering enough of the root system that it's sufficient for the tree, right? Needs good filters, as I mentioned, otherwise you have nothing but clogging problems. Can be labor intensive and high maintenance. There's no potential freeze protection from a drip system. Doesn't provide any. So monitoring soil moisture content and irrigation scheduling. So the purpose is to conserve, water resources, and you're conserving water, right? And you want to apply the proper amount and timing of irrigation to meet the crop demand. And you want to ultimately improve the crop yields and the quality, right? So avoid those drought stress periods. So there's many different methods, from the accounting method, which is like, you know, reducing a bank account, and then there's weather-based systems, which include looking at ET, or evapotranspiration, and crop coefficients, which I mentioned earlier. There's the use of devices that measure the moisture or the tension or the amount of water indirectly in the soil, such as tensiometers, capacitance probes, and there are some online apps as well. So this is just to show you a tensiometer. This one's actually installed in the ground, so you're not seeing, but it's down in the ground. And you can buy these. They can go 6 inches, 12, 24-inch deep. It depends on and how many you want and how deep you want to go. Gypsum blocks have been used in some cases. These are capacitance probes. These work very, very well. They tend to be quite expensive, but they do work very well in showing the moisture in the soil. There's also these mobile apps, and there happens to be one for avocado. There's also one for citrus, strawberries, and a number of others. So if you go to if you type in and go to this website, mobile app downloads or smart irrigation apps, you'll hit the website that has much more information about these ET-based irrigation applications that are actually on your cell phone. This is just showing you. So this is an example for avocado. Here you have rainfall and evapotranspiration on this side. And this is the rainfall in the gray. And this is the evapotranspiration, in other words, water loss from the trees and the soil, showing you. And you can see it increases in the summer and decreases in the winter. And this is the crop coefficient that was determined for avocado at this time. And you can see it ranges from 0 to 1.2 times what the evapotranspiration is. And so you can look at the crop stages. So dormancy, you can see that the value of this crop coefficient is below 1. It's not exact. And so if the evapotranspiration is 3 inches, it's 0.7 times 3 inches is what the tree is losing. You see what I mean? So flower bud development, that's during the fall. So again, low. But once you start to flower and fruit, you can see it increases. Fruit growth, it increases during that whole fruit development period. And then after harvest, it can reduce during this time. So this is just showing you, this is the apps for managing urban and agricultural irrigation. As I said, if you go up and search smart irrigation apps, University of Florida, you should hit it. This is just showing you a micro sprinkler. This is the avocado app. And this is the amount of water the sprinklers can put out, 29 gallons per hour. It has an efficiency of about 80%. This was the way it was scheduled to irrigate on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and how much per event. And then this tells you the accumulated rain in the past 7 days. So this will influence whether you want to change this. And you can actually map this out on the app. This is during the flowering and fruit set, and we're on day 22 of that. So you input the Grove site data and schedule, and it will recommend an irrigation schedule to you. And as Jeff had showed with the flooding, the USDA Farm Service Agency offers some financial assistance and guidance after environmental disasters. And these are a number of websites that you can go to. I would encourage you, before you even plant anything or purchase anything, or if you already have, to contact the Farm Service Agency. They have a number of programs that if you sign up with them, that can assist you. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And let me close this. And let me open up this other one. Excuse me. Can you see this, Jeff, or no?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, so let me share.
Coming up.
Okay, so I am screen sharing. And I'm going to hand it over to Jeff.
Okay, I'm gonna ask for permission.
Oh. Oh, yes, I confirm, yes. How about? Good?
Okay,
Great.
good work. Let's see. Okay. Okay, everyone. Now we're going to talk about hurricanes, which to me is the most interesting and, of course, the most the scariest of all these things. So I'm going to talk about the first section, and then Jonathan's going to take the second. Then we'll do the survey. Then we'll do Q&A. So I am not able to see the little clicker. There it is. Okay, so why is it important to be ready for hurricanes and be ready to do things afterwards? Obviously, you're going to have economic. Oops, somebody moved it forward. Okay. Economic and biological devastation. Look at those pictures there. If you guys have been through any kind of hurricane, you know what we're talking about. These are air layered line growth, so they don't have very good root systems. So you're going to get defoliation, fruit drop, tree destruction, limb, trunk damage, and breakage. So we're going to talk a couple times about Hurricane Andrew. That was 1992, and it seems like a long time ago, but we all remember that if we were there, because it was a Category 5, and it did some major damage. So Category 5, what about a Category 2? Hurricane Irma in 2018, that did quite a bit of damage as well. You see down below, looks like Lychee Grove, and then the arrows going up to the top left there. And then the bananas, of course, they went down. And if we look at, again, Hurricane Andrew in this chart in the bottom left, you see lime. So you're probably thinking, lime, we don't grow limes in South Florida. Well, we used to. There used to be quite a bit. And you see this green line, that's where it went up, up, up. And then yet little H is Andrew. That's a hurricane. And look at the production from about 7,000 all the way down to 2,000. And then, of course, the final blow was citrus canker, and that completely knocked it out. So not only trees, but your infrastructure. Hurricane Wilma, another Category 2, but look at the damage in those shade houses. So things that can help, or things rather that are going to get broken up, could be windbreaks, irrigation, pump houses, engines, and pole barns. And here you see the shade houses. So we saw the lime production. What about the avocado production after Hurricane Irma? Remember, that was only a Category 2, but look down in the red and the blue above it. Look at September, October. Look at those numbers, how low they are. So the second red line below is the percentage the crop was down for September, down 72%. October, down 96%. November, 96. December, 99%, 91, 99, and then 49. So that Category 2 storm did major damage to the crop for the year. So 2025, and we get this every year, we get the Atlantic hurricane season outlook, and it's never very good, is it? So named storms up to 19, hurricanes up to 10, major hurricanes 3 to 5. That does not sound good. So you're probably familiar with the Safer-Simpson hurricane scale. You've certainly heard these numbers, category 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And we've seen in the last maybe 5 or 6, 7 years that storms are going quickly from a 2 to a 4, a 2 to a 5. So that's very scary and obviously very dangerous. Speaking of category 5s, again, Hurricane Andrew, you see that picture on the left, it just hit, it went right down Main Street of Homestead and just knocked out houses, it knocked out groves, it knocked out everything. And the worst part was it was predicted to turn away, and then it just came straight at us. So wind damage, this could be from a tropical storm up to a category 5. You're going to get defoliation, fruit drop and scarring. The fruit can stay on the tree, but it will rub against the branches. It's scarred up. Limb damage, breakage, limb and trunk twisting. So the limbs stay on the tree, but they blow and they twist. So you're not going to really see this damage until much later. Trunk breakage, so not just the limbs, but the main trunk. The whole tree goes down and you have uprooting. So Hurricane Andrew, look at that devastation. So you had a category 5, you had 14 inches of rain to make things worse, and you have a 17-foot storm surge. So the water is coming up from the bay. Irma, category 2, still had 12 inches of rain and a 5-foot storm surge. Still did major damage there. That bottom right picture, you see a lot of fruit drop. Bottom left, fruit drop. Top left, you see a tree that was just toppled over. And if you look closely right there, you see that that tree didn't have a lot of roots that went down. It just was flat on top. So what about other damage? Debris. Let's say you're near some buildings, you could get some tiles that hit your trunk, stripping the bark off trees. You can have flooding, which we talked about earlier. So low oxygen soil conditions, we know all about that. Root rot caused by various fungi, we know about that. You have these weak trees, you're going to get increased insect attack, especially bark-boring insects. We have a picture of that in a bit. Salinity stress, if you have that storm surge or the wind blows salt up on the trees. And then you have damage to grove infrastructure, your irrigation systems, which can be a problem after the storm because the trees maybe don't have as many leaves, they don't have as many roots, so they're going to need a little irrigation. Damage to equipment, windscreens, and buildings. So there's the bark stripping, top left. There's the salt burn, bottom left. Flooding in the middle, some carambolas there. And then the top right, you see the bark borers. You look at these little straws here, that's where they're going in and pushing out the sawdust as they go into the tree. Here's infrastructure damage. Again, you have these shade houses that are just going down. And that's not cheap or easy to fix. And if you have things under shade and suddenly they're in full sun, they're going to burn up. They're going to get scalded. Remember, dragon fruit are all on these sometimes 4x4s, sometimes other things, but they're very heavy, very top heavy. So they could go down in a storm, and that's really going to be difficult to reset. So pre-hurricane planning, now is the time. We have time before the storms come. So now is the time to do things on this page. Number one, be organized. Get your plan. What you can do, you have several groves, rank them. Which one is making the most money after a storm? That's the one you go to fix first. Rank grows as to potential repair needs. So which one's going to need the most? If you have dragon fruit over here and mangoes over there, the dragon fruit are going to need more, but maybe the mangoes are making more money, so you're going to go to them first. Pre-storm documentation. How many trees do you have? How many groves do you have? What's the infrastructure? Document that. Bottom right, photo, documentation, and records backup. So bottom left, you're documenting. Bottom right, you're doing it with pictures. So here's a picture of the grove. Here's a picture of a row. Here's a picture of my tractor. Here's a picture of my pole barn. So you have all that. Keep that on your camera, but also put it up into the cloud, because we don't know what's going to happen to our cameras or our phones. And then register groves with the USDA. We talked about this at the end of both our talks. They have programs like the TAP and the NAP, which will help you after a storm, help you replant. So pre-hurricane, what are you going to need after? So we're planning for after. What are you going to need? If you can get it, backhoe, front end loaders, because you're going to have to pick up these big trees. Tractors, water wagon, you're going to have to water the trees, and maybe your irrigation is out. Maybe your pump is out. Chainsaws, definitely going to need chainsaws. Slings, shovels, loppers, hose, all these things. Chainsaws, we see fuel below that, but for chainsaws, let's not forget extra chains, because that one chain is going to get dull fairly quickly. Labor, have some people that you know can help you out after the storm. Pre-train your workers on chainsaw safety. Chainsawing is going to be happening all over the place, and it shouldn't just be one person. And then miscellaneous supplies, you're going to have to reset these trees, so maybe have some 2x4s to hold them up. Again, pre-hurricane. Assess grove site selection and possible likelihood of less or greater damage. So if you're adjacent to a natural area, that can be a natural windbreak, so that could help. If you're adjacent to a vegetable field or nursery, you may get things flying in to your grove. If you have a low area, you have flooding potential, because we're going to get a lot of rain and some storm surge if you're near the coast. Windbreak stability. So if you have some big trees as a windbreak, but let's say they're not really well rooted, they could go down and fall right into your grove. Grove sites adjacent to nurseries and vegetable fields may sustain additional damage due to wind-blown rocks or debris. So there's an Attamoya with debris damage from a neighboring nursery or vegetable field, because that wind is just going right through there. Then again, you have the flood potential. There's some papayas. We know papayas don't like floods. Assess the grove based on its pre-plant soil preparation. Is it trenched or not trenched? Is it bedded or not bedded? What's the propagation method? Jonathan mentioned this. Grafted trees are going to do better than air layer trees, because air layer trees, the roots are not as strong. And there's conflicting observations on the benefit of trench versus non-trench. So we're not sure about it. So cultural practices that minimize potential for hurricane damage and increase potential for recovery. So these are things you can do beforehand that are gonna make it less of a problem when the hurricane comes. So always implement and maintain a tree size management program, always. So keep your trees pruned, very important. There's many reasons why you would prune your tree, but in this case, we're talking about for hurricanes. You're gonna get less wind resistance. You're gonna get a better chance that those trees aren't gonna go down. You can also avoid low-lying areas so you don't get flooded. Again, control tree size of planted natural windbreaks. So you want your windbreaks to stop the wind from getting into your grove, but you don't want them so big that they're just going to topple over into your grove. If possible, protect irrigation infrastructure and then have the equipment to do what you need to do afterwards. And there you see on the right, on the top, mango and guava topping and hedging. They actually use these machines that just go around the top on the side and slice them. So this is controlling the height. Look at those guavas on the right. That's not really going to blow over it unless it's something like the bottom right where you have the non-pruned guava and it just fell over. Okay, rule of thumb for pruning. Your trees should be no higher than 2/3 the distance between your tree rows. So you have your rows, then in between those rows, you have a distance. If the distance is 20 feet, 2/3 of that is 13 to 14 feet. So that's the height of your trees. If between the rows, you have 22 feet, height 14 to 16, 25 feet, 16 to 18. This is going to let in sun and let in light. So that's why you do it, to maintain light on the sides of the canopy and reduce potential for tree toppling and wind throw. So these are the heights you want to keep them at. Just remember, 2/3 the distance between your rows. So the row is what goes down where you're going to have the irrigation or maybe the beds. In between the row, that's where you're going to measure the 2/3. So here we have recommended plant height. This is something Jonathan put together. And I do have a publication on pruning tropical and subtropical fruit trees, which has this chart in the back. So here's all the different sizes. And you can see, we look at avocado. You want to keep that at 12 to 18 feet. Guava, much smaller, 3 to 12. Jackfruit, 8 to 14. Let's look at mango, 6 to 18. And 6 to 18 would really depend on the cultivar. Some of them grow a lot slower, a lot wider. Some of them really shoot towards the stars. So that would be where you want to keep an 18. So Andrew, we had some before and after pictures. So guava pruned, top left, not pruned, bottom left, not pruned, fell down. Because you have all that wind shear on the leaves, so that just pushes right down. Avocado pruned, top right, not pruned, bottom right. You can see where they made the cuts on this avocado right here. So you had this strong little area here, and up here, you just lost leaves, but it didn't blow down. So if in Miami-Dade County with a rocky soil above an oolitic limestone, we've talked about that, and you can see some of the limestone here in this top left picture. You have trench versus non-trench grove. Here's a trench grove, still went down, but here's a flat planted, just went down like that. This might be easier to reset. Okay, I'm going to pass it to Dr. Crane. historical experience, tree size control practices, and I'm going to put those publications again into the chat. And I see we have some questions that popped up. I'm going to try to answer those. Remember, when Jonathan is done, we'll do a very quick 3-minute survey. And then we're going to do Q&A. We've had a few Qs. I've done a few As, but we'll do the rest as we go.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Can you hear me? All right.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so this is just a little bit of the historical experience with tree size control practices and the results from a hurricane, right? So if you're consistently implementing a tree size program, you're going to improve this tree survival. You're going to prevent the trees from toppling over, and you're also going to enhance the potential for the tree to rapidly recover after a significant storm. So after Hurricane Andrew, we did extensive surveys of rating different types of tropical fruits, how big they were, how tall they were before the storm, and then how many fell over, how many got pulled out of the ground, how many were like totally destroyed. And so we found several things, that tree survival increased with the age of the tree, and that's because larger trees have this massive trunk and limbs, which helps to stabilize the tree up to a point. However, as the trees increased in height, so you could have a massively big tree, but if it was super tall, it probably fell over or was pulled out of the ground. So there is a limit to even how massive trunks and limbs can stabilize a tree. Okay, so we found that more avocado, mango, and mamey trees remained upright in groves where people had limited the size of the trees, 12 to 22 feet. And there was also less toppling for trees up to about 16, more trees, less toppling up to about 16 feet than trees that were 22 feet. So again, the lower profile trees tended to stay where they were. And the same was true with lychee, longan, guava, and carambola trees. With lime trees, we've mentioned this several times before, trees produced from air layers or marcottage did not survive a significant windstorm very well. And that trees that were grafted lime trees tended to stay where they were. Air layered guava trees, if they were kept small, remained standing. However, if they were allowed to get 12 to 15 feet tall, many of them fell over. The majority of them fell over. Air layered lychee trees, some of them, and it sort of varied by variety. Mauritius, there was quite a bit of broken off trees compared to Brewster at that time. That observation may or may not be an artifact that there was more Mauritius acreage, but it did seem apparent at the time. So we also know that flooding in low-lying areas, and it was especially detrimental to things like atemoyas, avocados, jackfruit, mamey, papaya, passion fruit, and sugar apple. And also, saturated soils are much more, the trees are much more likely to fall over, as we saw in those Category 2 storms, because the ground was so saturated with water. Hurricane Andrew was relatively dry, and so it was mostly caused, the trees being pushed over was mostly caused by the wind. With Irma, with the Category 2 storms, the ground was so saturated that it was hard for the roots to stabilize the tree, so we saw some increased toppling. We also saw increased root rot, disease development, because these root rotting fungi like low oxygen or flooded soil saturated conditions. And that, decline and death of some of these species, avocados, papaya, sugar apple, and mamey, can be quite rapid after a storm. So that can happen. So protecting the infrastructure. So if you're able to protect your sprinklers, that's not common, but In some cases, sprinklers are removable. If you have time and you have the staff to do it, if you remove the sprinklers, that can be helpful to save them. Same thing with saving the engines and the pumps, putting tractors and other equipment you're going to need for after the storm in a safe place if you can. In some cases, pre-drilling alternative wells that could be used to pull water from, and then have those wells marked and protected or capped, but accessible for after the storm can be helpful. Again, taking photographs of the grove before the storm and then to document the size of the trees, the fruit load, everything is really important because you want the before and the after pictures if you're going to try to get some assistance uh, after the storm. So with Pitaya, we found that, if you had larger diameter poles, the vines tended to be more stable. That makes sense than smaller sized poles, and that at least 2 feet be put in the ground. And then also, timing the pruning on these vines to reduce the weight on the top and the likelihood of toppling. And I know that's daunting to do, and before a storm. Do I go out and prune these way back and then the storm doesn't hit? Or, and I lose that production. So it's a hard call to make. So this is dragon fruit that is very, very large vines on these poles. And you can see there's some of them are propped up. And then this is a vine on the side, on the right, showing there's less resistance to the wind, so it's less likely to fall over. So post-hurricane, so you want to, as I mentioned, document the damage with photographs and brief text. You want to contact the USDA Farm Service Agency and the insurance adjusters to report the damage. You want to work with FSA and the insurance companies so that you can proceed with recovery as soon as possible. It's imperative that you keep receipts of all equipment, rental costs, fuel, labor expenses. So just keep in mind, try to keep track of all that and keep receipts so that potentially you could get reimbursed for some of it. So after the hurricane, you want to assemble the equipment and the manpower or the women power. You want to gain access to the grove. Probably one of the most important things to do, if possible, is to try to cover the trunks of toppled trees. Why? Because you've had this trunk of this tree has been in the shade for the past 5, 10, 20, 30 years. All of a sudden, it's exposed to full sun. That tissue under the bark can overheat, killing that tissue, the xylem and the phloem and the cambium, and the tree is going to decline and die. So you want to try to cover that exposed trunk area as quickly as possible. One way to do that is to cut off some of the canopy. That'll do two things. Cut off a lot of the canopy, actually. That'll do two things. One is it reduces the potential for water loss through the tree because you've removed the leaves. The other thing, too, is you can use those limbs that you've just cut off to cover the trunk, just to get it in the shade as quickly as possible. If you can, you want to try to repair the irrigation system because you're going to need water to water the trees, hopefully. And also then, get all the equipment together for resetting the tree. And we've already talked about all the equipment you use. One just mention on the slings. So the sling, is used to pull the tree up. So you've hat racked the tree, you've cut most of the canopy off, right? So that you can actually, the trees are, depending on how big the tree is, how old the tree is, they may be very, very heavy. You're not going to pick up a 20-foot tree unless you have massive equipment. So you're going to want to hat rack that tree somewhere between, 4 and maybe 10 feet. And you're going to want to pull it up with a sling. But you want to be sure that sling is made of like rope or cloth, not metal, not a metal cable, and not a chain. Why? two things. One is the metal cables or the chains will damage the tree's bark. So now you're causing more damage. Also, more importantly, if they snap, they become extremely dangerous to anybody around. They could get hit with that broken cable or the chain as it breaks. You could end up injuring or killing somebody. So you don't want to use metal slings. So as I mentioned, so you can pile the brush and debris from the cut limbs. You're going to have to cut the trees back depending on, how big they are and everything else. But in general, let's say these are 10, 15 plus old trees. You're going to want to cut the tree back significantly. You can place that debris on the trunks of the trees, and that's a quick thing you can do because you're not going to get to all 145 trees in one day. It's going to take days to do this. So getting those trunks and major limbs in the shade as quickly as possible is really a good thing. It's going to save a lot more trees. You could use a whitewash and paint the upper trunks, but again, you have to have the whitewash, you have to have the equipment to spray it or to put it on the tree. And this is just showing you some directions on either using latex paint diluted or making your own whitewash, or purchasing Surround, which is a clay whitewash. So as I said, so pruning can be part of the debris removal, and it's also preparing the tree for resetting. So you got to reduce the weight of that tree. So you're going to remove a lot of it. You're going to end up hat racking the trees. You can also use some of these pruned limbs as braces for propping or resetting the tree. So you're going to prop the tree back up, and you can use the forks on some of these limbs as something to help stabilize the tree for a while. And you can use the debris when you get a chance. That can be chipped or shredded and used as mulch around the trees. So prune the process for resetting a tree is prune the tree back. You may end up having to prune off some of the root system if it's not going to go back in the soil easily, if they've come completely out of the ground. You want to remove some of the soil from the back of where the root system was, so you can reset the tree at as near to the same level as it was in the ground before. And as I mentioned, you'll use a sling to help lift that tree back into place. And you can use some of the old limbs that you've cut into forked stabilizers to help prop up the tree. One thing too, especially with large trees, when you are pruning the top of the tree off, hat racking the tree or making it a stump, you want to make sure there's nobody on the back side of that root system. Why? Because sometimes what happens is the weight of that tree shifts when you remove that canopy, and the tree starts to reset itself. And anybody behind that root ball could be hurt. So you've got to be cognizant of who's there, and people need to clear out when you are hat racking or stumping that tree to pull it back up. So here's a tree that fell, and you can see the root system there and the canopy there. And so the soil was pulled back. You can see, so it was pulled back. And this is just showing you again that the soil was pulled back. Some of the root system had to be pruned. Came in with a backhoe. We went ahead and cut most of the canopy off of the tree. And then this backhoe was used to pull the tree back up to standing, and then the soil was pushed back around the tree. Here it is here, standing. The tree was set back up. We pushed soil back around the root system, and then we used several of the limbs as stakes to stabilize the tree. And here's that same tree about 4 years later. That's not a stake for the tree, but that's a post for a sign. Then you want to water the tree in, and you can mulch several inches. from the trunk outward. This will help conserve moisture. You want to water that tree in really well. You do not want to put, 25 inches of mulch around the tree. It needs to be 3, 4, 5 inches maximum. If you make it too thick, you're actually going to impede the exchange of oxygen and CO2 from the root system out into the atmosphere, and the tree is going to act like it's being oxygen stressed. Okay, so as I said, you want to and you want to keep the mulch directly off the trunk a few inches. So the organic debris, and I know, at least initially, probably a lot of it is just going to be stacked in the row middles or between trees in the rows. Smaller wood can be shredded, and larger wood can be chipped. In some cases, debris can be moved to the right of way or along the road, and taken away either by the state or the county or the feds if there is a program for this. But you need to check with that. Some after natural disasters, some counties or state and local or federal government will take the debris from the storm, from the edge of your grove or on the right of way. Others will not, and you can't pile the material there. They're not going to take it, and they don't want it there. And so you may end up with a fine or something like that. So you need to check before piling it near on the right of way. So here there was no roadside pickup after this storm, and that people had piled it along the road. That's a problem for the grower because they're going to mandate that you remove that at your cost. Here it is. In this case, they stacked it between the trees as they were doing their recovery. Here they were shredding the debris and using it as mulch. So irrigation practices. So the sooner you can repair the irrigation system, the better. And I know that's difficult after some storms, but it will behoove you because this way you can irrigate these trees that are trying to recover. And so trees with some remaining canopy. Now remember, trees lose water through their leaves. If the trees don't have any canopy, they're not going to be losing much water through the tree. So that will inform you about how often and how much you need to irrigate. So if they have some canopy, you want to irrigate maybe 1 or 2 times a week until the canopy starts to come back. And it's better to do one good soaking rather than a bunch of little irrigation events, right? Also, wind-blown salt spray can also cause damage to the foliage and some dieback. If possible, to remove some of this salt off of the canopy, that can be done. It's hard to do when everything else has to be done, but that is one potential thing you could do if you have the equipment and the time. Fertilizer. So again, even obtaining and distributing fertilizer may be an issue for a while until things start to recover to a certain extent. But when you do see new growth, you could go ahead and start fertilizing. And it's better to use small amounts rather than large amounts and small amounts frequently. So here I have a little table. It says tree damage and the recommendation. So large limb loss, reduce the fertilizer rate in proportion to the tree damage. So if you've lost half the canopy, reduce the fertilizer rate to about half. If it's just mainly leaf and twig, you may actually increase the fertilizer rates because the tree is going to recover very quickly. So again, small frequent amounts are better. Weed control. This can be a problem. If possible, mow and herbicide if you can, right? Weeds, in some cases, if they're killed, in some situations, some places, if you have severe drought after that, it could be a fire hazard. That's generally, we've not seen this, but it could be all that dead vegetation. Okay, observations by crop. We found that Atemoyas and sugar apples generally did not reset or recover from moderate to severe damage. Their root systems seem to be quite brittle, and that perhaps replanting was we found that replanting was a better option because they just slowly declined over many, many months. In general, avocados that were reset regrew after the storm quite well and resumed production in 1 to 3 years. Again, though, if you had flooding, this could be an added issue and cause additional tree death or decline. In general, most of the bananas fell over and the fruit was lost. But because they're underground growing points or corms or underground, you could remove those pseudostems and they would begin to send out new shoots or new pseudostems after the storm. Carambola, in general, they regrew quite well after the storm and actually flowered and set a fruit crop. So they recovered quite well. Guava, if they were of low profile, generally recovered quite well and got back into production quite quickly. The limes, historically, the grafted trees, withstood the storm and came back and resumed production, but not the air layer trees because they were gone. They were blown away. Longans, generally, those that were reset, they regrew well and resumed production in 1 to 2 years. Mauritius or lychee trees, they tended to refoliate quite well and resume production 1 or 2 years later. Mamey, historically, these trees did reset and regrow quite well. However, those mamey trees that had major limb damage actually delayed by 4 or 5 years before they got back into production. What appeared to happen is that by that heavy limb damage, the new shoots that came out were sort of juvenile, or actually they behaved as juvenile limbs. And what I mean by that is that they were not capable of flowering and fruiting for quite a while, 4 to 5 years, until they matured. So it's sort of like this rejuvenation process that happened because of how because that new growth that came out of the heavily damaged trees behaved as if it was juvenile. Mangoes, there was a lot of mixed results. Some declined, some regrew quite well. The mango tree trunks appeared to be more susceptible to sunburn than, let's say, avocado trees. And you can see, avocado trees have quite a thick bark, many layers of bark. The mango trees, it tends to be less of a thick bark, and that might be part of the problem. Papaya trees, of course, lost their fruit. Regrowth was quite variable. Really, probably replanting is a better option and was a better option. Pitaya, again, if you had a lot of toppling of the trees, you'd need to, remove the vine, reset new poles. We don't have a lot of experience with a significant storm and how the pitaya or dragon fruit behaved. So again, prior to the impending storm, photographs, documentation, register with the USDA Farm Service Agency, keep receipts. After the storm, again, photographs, write notes, document things, and keep the receipts. Okay, so summary, plan for a potential disaster well before it occurs if you can, because trying to get supplies and things lined up, 5 days, 1 day before a storm is really going to be a daunting task. Tree size management, I can't emphasize, really is the best insurance of limiting the potential storm damage. If you're allowing your trees, especially let's talk about the larger trees, mamey, avocado, mango, lychee, if you're letting those trees get much above 15, 17, 18 feet, you're increasing the potential they are going to be severely damaged or toppled over during a storm. So if you maintain a lower tree profile, you'll weather the storms much better. And then, of course, the post-hurricane practices are aimed at trying to get the tree back into production as quickly as possible. Here's some extension websites that have to do with disaster planning and hurricanes and other things. So you can go up and search the EDIS website or the Ask IFAS website. This is the extension administration website specifically for disasters, this type of thing. And then again, here's this resources from the USDA Farm Service Agency. Again, I would encourage you to contact them, make contact, register with them for any resources they may have for before and after a natural disaster. And with that, I think I am done.
Jonathan, thank you so much. Wonderful as always.